It's great to see everybody here. This Zoom call is going to function more like a webinar. And so myself and two of my colleagues who you'll meet in a moment will be doing the talking and the sharing to get you set up for the scenario planning that you will be doing with your schools and organizations. So I'm going to start by just offering a few technical suggestions. You can leave your video on, but you can just as well leave it off because we'll be the ones that are doing the talking. So go ahead and turn that video off if you would like. And you may prefer to have speaker view enabled so that you can see the person who's doing the talking as we share resources and slides. Speaker view should be available at the top right of your screen if you are in Zoom. So if you look kind of at the top right, there should be a button that says speaker view, or it might just be an image. It looks like a big rectangle with 3 little squares above it. Go ahead and click that. And that should be enough for you to kind of get the most of the way this experience is set up. All right, so with that being said, I'm just gonna click admit all because we have some few folks coming in here, and I'm gonna introduce my wonderful colleague, Laura McBain. Laura McBain is one of the co-directors of the K-12 lab and has been engaged in the scenario planning work with myself and graded the international school in Sao Paulo, which is a school that has helped us develop a lot of these resources, as well as working, of course, in collaboration with our colleagues in the D.school, including Lisa Solomon, who will meet in just a moment. We've created these materials and are really excited to share them kind of widely with our public. So without further ado, I'm gonna spotlight Laura's video and she's gonna take it away.
Good morning, everyone. It is such a pleasure to see everyone. There's a few faces that I recognize on the call, and so it's nice. I see Stephanie, who I know, and a few folks on this call that I recognize, and I think actually my good friend from high school is actually on this call. Kristen Kirkland is on this call as well, so it's just lovely to see everyone here this morning. This is a topic really today is jumping into really thinking about how we might really get ready for fall 2020. I know many people on this call are thinking about what school might look like in the fall and how do we best prepare our students, our faculty, our community for these uncertain times. I myself have been a teacher and a principal. I was talking to friends last night, and all of us are wondering what is the best way to get ready for fall 2020, knowing that we are facing an uncertain time and that the conditions in which we are designing for fall 2020 are shifting. Last night when we were chatting, I said, wow, if I was back in my principal, I was a former principal for a long time and was a principal at High Tech High, which is a school down in Southern California. I would be planning my back to school August days. I would be in the process of thinking about what that week would look like. And I would have a pretty strong certainty about what I wanted to do and how I would do it and the conditions that I wanted to create for my staff. And I know many school leaders and school teams, your normal preparing process is not the same. And what you do to prepare right now is different. And the conditions in which you're designing your schedule, the well-being of your students and the well-being of your staff and the type of teaching and how you teach is shifting. And so today we're going to be jumping into a 90-minute webinar that is just a precursor into a larger work that our lab is undertaking around how we help really teachers really think of themselves as futurists. And my dear friend Lisa Solomon is going to walk us through some of the things that we're doing. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen really quick. We'll see how that goes. As all of us know, that Zoom loves to be persnickety, so we'll just give it a go. And if it doesn't work, I'll have my friend Ariel share that out. But we'll just see how this goes. So without further ado, you should be able to see my screen. Let me know if you can. And I just want to initially say welcome, of course, on behalf of the D.school, and welcome you all here as you go through. And the
Laura, try and hit Command-Shift-F on your computer if you're in preview. And then that should make it full screen.
Let me just try that one more time. Sorry, we had two things going. Let's give that a go one more time. I thought that was going to work. And we'll try that one more time. Let's try.
Here, Here,
There we
I'll
go.
share my screen, Laura,
I think
and then
I
this should
got it.
function good.
Great,
Great.
thank you. Like all things technology, my screen crashed, my computer crashed twice this morning. So as all things, we all know how this is going. So if you want to go to the next slide, that would be great. Thanks, Ariel. So the K-12 lab, the next slide, thank you. Our mission, and as you'll see from our calls today, our dear friend Lisa and Ariel and Laura are here. And if you want to go to our next slide, great. The mission of the K-12 lab is really a fundamental piece. As a person who's been a teacher and a principal, our job ultimately is to determine and design ways to obliterate the opportunity gaps in K-12 education by designing new and equitable models and sharing different design approaches with students and educators. And ultimately what we're trying to do is not just teach people about design, but equip them in becoming designers themselves to make change in the world. And so we believe that we are a catalyst for creative confidence in K-12. That means giving everyone the agency and the feeling that they are creative people in any shape to make the change that they want to see happen in the world. So next slide, Ariel. And how we do that is we spend a lot of time thinking and working with researchers at Stanford. And that means we teach full time. Myself, Ariel, and I are all teaching right now, just like many of us, online in a remote condition right now. And we work with Stanford researchers to think about what is the breaking research right now in K-12 education. And then we also work and train with educators across the globe. We have educators from Brazil, from Chicago, from New York, and we work with them to train and help them think about how they can use design in their practice. One of my friends on this call is Stephanie Brown. She was part of our School Retool Fellowship, and she used design to really hack her way and design her way to create more equitable outcomes for her school within San Diego. And then lastly, we really think about different approaches to education, including the one today, which is around futures thinking, and how we can use this type of approach and thinking and use design to help us make our way forward. So we do these three things consistently, merging the best of research and the best of design to create bold approaches. So today, we have a couple things on our deck. One is thinking about futures thinking, and our colleague Lisa will be sharing a little bit of like, what is it? What actually does it mean? Is it people thinking about the futurists? Is it sci-fi? What exactly is it? And what are the possibilities for it in K-12 education, along with what are the intersections between design thinking and futures thinking, and what is that mix up? And then we're going to get a little bit into how you can take this scenario planning process that we have shared with you, or you will get later today, and how you can facilitate that with your staff. We'll talk a little bit about the mindsets and the approaches that you might want to carry when you're facilitating with adult learners. And then lastly, we'll give you a walkthrough of the asset that you'll get and how you might utilize that for your own context. So first and foremost, I firmly believe, and everyone in our K-12 lab believes, that educators are shaping the future every day through the macro and micro moments that we have with our young people. The future is shaped by educators and the students right now. We often think that sometimes we don't have control over the future, or the educators ourselves are recipients of the future. And yet, the conversations that we have with our young people, the activities that we design, and the structures that we create as leaders, as principals, shape the future that we want to live in. And those are the conversations we have in passing. Those are the decisions that we make about our schedule. And those are the decisions that we make on behalf and with young people that almost to some extent dictate the future that they can make for themselves. Our decisions to put students in some classes versus another, right? To engage one activity versus over another dictate how the future will unfold. I believe that our young people today, and we're seeing that now, are demonstrating more agency than ever. They are telling us by showing up to online classes or not showing up what they like, right? They are choosing to engage on social media and sharing their voices in ways that they're choosing. And so we believe that, like our young people, the educators are shaping the future. And we have an opportunity, I think, in this moment as educators, as futurists, to really use this moment to address the inequities that this pandemic has revealed to the world. We know as educators that education has been long ripe with inequities. We know that some people have access and some people don't. And as educators, we've known this for a long time. You know, we've been struggling and constantly trying to battle and work through it. And yet that moment and these inequities that we have known for a long time are almost being exacerbated and being revealed to the world. And so we hope that we can use these futurist thinking strategies to obliterate those gaps and really ensure that all students have access to a brighter future, and that all students leave their K-12 education with a sense of agency, with a sense of optimism that they can make change in the world. And that's the kind of work that we do, and that's the kind of work that we believe is important for the world. So without further ado, Ariel is going to stop sharing his screen, and he is going to allow our dear friend Lisa to unmute herself. And Lisa is a designer in residence here at the Stanford D.school. She is a futurist, formerly of Singularity University. And today she's going to be talking a lot about, again, what is futures thinking and the intersection between design and futures.
Great. Thank you so much, Laura and Ariel, and all of you for showing up on Friday morning. It's really exciting to see the interest in scenario planning, see the interest in futures. And as Laura mentioned, we see futures as an opportunity to help you not only understand how the future might unfold, but to think of yourselves as futurists. That I think this is an incredible opportunity to learn more about what is futures thinking, how is it teachable and learnable, and how can we use it to better imagine bolder possibilities and bring those possibilities to life. So I've been doing futures thinking for almost 20 years, starting with a practice in scenario planning. And what I really learned over that time was that it is a leadership skill that allows us to navigate ambiguity and to tap into our imagination in order to bring about the preferred future we'd like to see come to life, while also trying to mitigate the future that we'd like to avoid. We certainly can't control the future, but as Laura mentioned, we are not and don't have to be passive recipients of what it brings to us. So just really quickly, we can think of futures as a practice, a discipline, a mindset that allows us to understand how the world might change and why. So really applying both critical thinking and creative thinking to understand the wide range of possibilities of how the future might unfold. And we can use design to understand along the way, what might people need in those futures? So design thinking is wonderful for putting students, humans, teachers at the center of the problem-solving process. We understand that the context in which those people live, in which we live, does not stay the same. It changes. So together, these two disciplines helps us really embrace that agency to bring the future that we'd like to see come to life. So I was brought into the D.school about 1.5 years ago to start to probe, to understand, how do we better understand the future? What do we think is inevitable? How do we cultivate empathy for the future? And really understand what these different contexts might tee up for learning, for education, for teachers, for students. Who shapes the future? Can we empower students to feel like they are shapers of the future? And what is the role of educators to create conditions to do that? So we have been launching a series of new classes that impart this to our students. We've been working very closely with schools and teachers to help them see how, particularly at this moment, we can lean into this discipline and bring it into our students and model it. I want to suggest that futures thinking, or being a futurist, is not about predicting or delivering or having certainty about the future. It is not about having that crystal ball and saying, this is exactly how the future is going to play out. And a lot of us are super hungry for that certainty right now. Every day we're turning on the TV or listening to news to saying exactly what will the future bring and when. Futures thinking is actually a practice that allows us to explore multiple futures, to understand how to look at drivers, how to understand how the context is changing so that we could be more nimble, more agile. We could make bets on the things that are robust, that are relatively predetermined, so we can feel like we have some sense of influence over the things that we can control, that we can bring into this world. And I would suggest, after doing this work for many, many years, there's a lot more predetermined than we ever realize. And when we lean into that, then we can feel like we can have the sense of agency that will help not only our colleagues handle the increasing uncertainty, but certainly our students as well. So I'm going to just share 3 big kind of meta ways of thinking about the futures thinking and the practices that I think we can all start to model starting today, and starting with the tools that the K-12 lab have started to put together to help you have different conversations with your team to better prepare for fall 2020 and beyond. And the first notion is this thought of learning how to see the future. And it's really learning how to see the futures, plural, because as we just said, it's not a single future that's going to unfold. And in that, we have to lean into our bold imagination, that a lot of time we're looking for the forecasts and for the probabilities to tell us how the future might unfold. And what we really need to do is allow ourselves to lean into our creativity, to look at how the world is changing around us and develop more anticipatory skills, to develop muscles around long-term thinking, even when the metrics are gearing us towards short-term outcomes, and to sensitize contextual intelligence, trying to understand how the world might change and why. What are changes in the technology? What are changes in the political environment? What are changes in environmental and sustainability, to help us understand how the world around us might change and the context in which our schools and our teaching is going to occur. And here's just one example of a way that we do that. So I teach a class at Stanford called Inventing the Future, where every week we introduce students to both creativity practices and futures practices, where we start by looking at a known trend that is unfolding, that's backed by data. And we allow ourselves to flex our imagination to say, well, what would happen next? And then what would happen next? And then what could happen next? To allow us to map the full range of possibilities within a relatively short amount of time, even if they seem ridiculous, to make connections so that we're more aware, we're opening up our peripheral vision so that when we see or hear about something that may not have even sort of captured our attention earlier, we're able to start to breadcrumb to say, wow, this is actually something that could unfold. Perhaps this is an early signal. How do we get more information? How do we get more informed about this? So this is something called the futures wheel, and it's something we could all do. And it allows us to hold multiple possibilities at the same time, parking our judgment around what we want or don't want to happen, but just to allow us to have a different conversation. So this is just one tool that helps us see the future. Another one that is just an easy thing to do is to jumpstart our thinking about the future by asking about headlines into the future. And these could be headlines that are geared towards technology trends or even learning trends or education trends. So here's just one that would fast forward us 10 years from now. Retirement of the last blank marks the end of the blank industry. What does that allow us to do? And this is just starting our sort of nimble mindset. Sometimes we say President blank just announced blank, or schools just announced the launch of blank. So lots of ways to make sure that we're not holding on too much to the future, to the current reality that we know, that we're allowing ourselves to flex that imagination. I want to suggest that there's lots of different ways to see the future. This is one of my favorite. Laura mentioned sci-fi. Even if you feel like, I don't know how to tap into my imagination, you can use incredible works of literature, and now on media, there's so much sci-fi that's out there that allows us to think differently, prompts a different conversation. And this is just, of course, a great example of a sci-fi story that was written over 200 years ago by Mary Shelley that's now in many ways becomes science fact. You know, we can see the precursor of what's happening in synthetic biology, and we can use this narrative to prompt some different questions. So that's seeing the future, and that's really a mindset as you go into scenario planning, is to let go of the future that you want to bring to life, that you hope comes to life, and we're all walking around with that. That's called the official future in futurist terms. We have to allow ourselves to look beyond that official future, to look for oftentimes even the ridiculous. Okay, the next area that we can sort of embrace is this notion of how do we shape the future? So once we've mapped the full possibilities, how do we actually make choices to bring about our preferred future? And we're all carrying that in our head. And this is where we need to lean into some methods of systems thinking. Certainly schools sit within a larger system that has different stakeholders at play and different sources of influence. In many ways, particularly with the advent of technology being an increasing part of our life, we have to consider the ethical considerations of what future we want to bring to life. In many ways, my class, Inventing the Future, came about because we saw so many students at Stanford leaning into computer science and engineering, and we wanted to make sure we were empowering them with the question of not, can I bring this to life, but should I bring this to life? How do I get ahead of the unintentional consequences by thinking about the possibilities? Shaping the future requires an entrepreneurial mindset to bring about something that didn't exist before. And many of us are doing that right now. It also asks that we think about it through the lens of critical thinking, through a theory of change, through logic and reason. So this is just one model that we use to help understand that. Perhaps some of you have used this in your strategic planning, where we take a look at what's happening on the surface, the observable events, but we don't stop there. We allow ourselves to say, what are the patterns that are driving this event? What are the trends underneath that? What are the system dynamics at play? To say, are we investing our time and energy in the highest leverage point? And in scenario planning, you're looking at some of the system dynamics, those driving forces that are the highest uncertainty and the highest impact that you're trying to explore in order to imagine how different worlds might come to be. One example I love that has come out in the last few years comes from a really unlikely partnership, and maybe some of you have been following this, between Sesame Street and the IRC, the International Rescue Committee, where they teamed together a couple years ago to win a $100 million grant, one of the largest given from the MacArthur Foundation, in order to invest in early childhood educational opportunities for refugee children that had been displaced by the Syrian and growing Middle East crisis. And one of the reasons why you can think of it through the lens of a futurist, if you look at that iceberg, is that on the one hand, you could see the observable event of millions of people migrating. But if you're thinking like a futurist, you're saying, these children that in many ways are getting lost by humanitarian aid, what do we know about them for sure? They will not stay children. They will grow up. And then and if we can couple that with what we know, for example, about neuroscience, that tells us that when children experience chronic stress and trauma, that their development is slower, we can then say, well, the leverage point that could be overlooked by all of the events is to say we have to invest in this youngest set in order to ensure that they have the best chance of being a thriving young adult and eventually adult in the world. So this is just an extraordinary collaboration to pay attention to. Here's another one. One of my students from this past semester, Inventing the Future, that ended in the winter, where our last class was abruptly turned online, like many of you, she coupled with a number of our other student friends in different colleges to take a look at high school, middle school, and elementary school to say, how do we cultivate hope in a pandemic? So these are college students that created a competition, a global competition, to allow young students to feel like they had agency in the world to share their hope. This was out of nothing. And they created something, and they used their creative hustle in order to create incentives for these young students. And this is just one picture of a submission that's just unfolded in the last 6 weeks. So this is called the Crown Education Competition. One project that I've been really passionate about is shaping a future of citizens. So I've been working on an effort called Vote by Design, where we're engaging next-gen voters to better understand who they are voting for and why, as they think about the first time they are voting for the president and other elected officials in the November election. So this is something that breaks down the process and bridges what students learn in their history classes with how to see themselves as contributing citizens in the world. And it's just been extraordinary to see the change in how they embrace their agency as voters. So one way that we do that is bringing in this notion of seeing the future. We actually expose them to possible futures that require presidential leadership. Like, I hate to say it, when we first created this a year ago, a pandemic. We had a scenario that exposed students to a flu-like virus that started off in China, and they had to embrace the leadership qualities that a president might need in order to handle that potential future. We have several others of these futures that are in plain sight to give them a sense of what it would take to shape the future. The last big area that I want to explore with you about how to think of ourselves as futurists is the qualities it takes to share the future with others. So futures is not just imagination, it's the ability to ignite a conversation, an aligned vision with others. And here I want to suggest the power of story is so powerful. As you think about preparing for fall 2020, you're having these leadership conversations. You should be asking yourselves, how do we share this more broadly with our community? How do we communicate in ways that get the community aligned with this possibility and get them to want to participate in bringing this future to life? And here I just want to share another one of my absolute favorite stories of how powerful it can be to embrace the idea of sharing narratives about the future. This comes from Meredith Hutchinson, a colleague of ours, who started a program called Vision Not Victim, where she went into marginalized communities to help young girls imagine their future selves and take a beautiful picture of that narrative so that they had an asset to share with their parents and their communities that would help make this future come to life. So here on the right, you can see a young doctor of the future who is not saying, when I grow up, I want to be, but instead is saying, I am a doctor. And I decided to become a doctor because of what I saw in my community and how I wanted to help those that were suffering and in need. And when they have these narratives that are immersive and so vivid, it changes the conversation. It makes it much more real for everyone else. And so I want to encourage you, as you think about the scenario planning that you're going to do, how do you share it in a way that is vivid and gets others on board, that isn't just another plan that they have to digest? Just another example I want to share about using a design mindset to bring these futures to life. In our class, Inventing the Future, we had students work on 50-year utopian and dystopian debates about the future, not to get it right, but to expose the wide range of possibilities so that we can then all be better shapers and seers of that future. So these mindsets, the ability to see the future more broadly, tapping into our imagination and anticipatory skills, the ability to then use our critical thinking and systems thinking in order to articulate what bets and what investments we're making on the things that are robust and the things that might have the biggest impact, and the ability to share the future with others so that they get on board, because we know that this is a team sport and we have to get others on board. This is some of the posture that we want you to hold as you think about using some of these new tools to help engage your community in thinking about your preferred future. So with that, I'm going to kick it back to Laura.
Awesome. Great. And we're just going to keep this kind of screen going. And we're going to take a few minutes now, probably in 10 minutes or so, just to get into questions. Lisa, this was an abbreviated piece on futures. And I know there's so much to share. And I think one of the things that we've been thinking about, and actually, well, I'm going to be monitoring the chat and taking your questions as well. And a question that I had, but also coming from Kelly McMahon, is also saying, how do you help groups identify what we call high leverage drivers? Right now, a lot of folks are looking for what are the indicators that are going to help them place some bets on what the future is. So can you speak a little bit about what are the drivers that you see that will help schools really think about what futures are coming and how they can think about that?
It is such a great question. And even that little piece of the process is so, so important. One of the distinctions of futures thinking as opposed to some of the traditional strategic planning that we do is that futures thinking does take this outside-in approach where we're looking at those drivers. And I'll just contrast that. I'm sure that many of you have been involved in strategic planning processes where you start with your maybe, let's call it your SWOT analysis. That's one of the most widely used strategic planning tools. And that stands for your strengths, your weaknesses, your opportunities, and your threats. Can I get a thumbs up? Is that sounding familiar? Yeah. Right? So if you notice, that starts with your strengths. What are you good at, right? So in some ways, the future doesn't really care what you're good at. I mean, I hate to say it like that, but they have, the future has its own plan in mind. So this is a nice complementary way, and we call it a STEEP analysis, to say what are the drivers that are happening in social trends? What are the drivers that are happening in technology? And certainly there's been so many that are particularly relevant to education even before the pandemic. What are drivers happening in the economic environment, in the environmental environment and sustainability, and even the political environment? And that's just one way to start to identify what are external drivers that might influence the context of your learning environment. And the way that we do that is we literally will brainstorm. So we might say, well, gee, on technology drivers, wow, we're seeing more and more connectivity. We're seeing more and more new ways that students are connecting with each other. So we would identify all these drivers, and then we might outline what we call an axis of uncertainty. What would it look like if technology, for example, was adapted very quickly within schools? What would it look like if it's adapting more slowly? And we identify these, and then we identify the ones that have the highest impact and perhaps the most uncertainty in school environments, and we start to play around with those two axes, putting them together to create very different worlds. So this is a process, and we can find some resources for you to understand this, but this is a really important part of the conversation to get people aligned around what they're seeing. It's also, it leads me to another part of futures thinking, which is to get multiple perspectives involved in the process. Because oftentimes we have the same group that are expert in their domain or expert in their school involved. It's really important to get other experts and other people involved to help ask different questions. So when I started scenario planning about 20 years ago, we had a group of about 100 what we called remarkable people. These were cultural anthropologists and technologists and journalists, writers. We even had an astronaut. We had musicians, because they saw the world differently, and they would allow us to ask different questions, to hold on to that beginner's mind, to make sure we were not holding on to our ideas too strongly held. So, and Laura, I'll take your cue on this based on the questions, but I do have an example of those driving forces in play that, might be helpful if people, want to see this in action.
Yeah, I mean, I think let's show one of those and we'll get to back
Okay.
some more questions. But yeah,
Okay.
let's look at an example.
Okay, great. So we've been doing a lot of scenario planning just internally within the D.school, and I've been helping some other groups think about, like, okay, lots of forecasts coming our way, but how do we start to make sense of it for ourselves? How do we empower our own community of futures thinkers, of future seers and shapers and sharers? So here I just want to share that we can just do this mini exercise, and hopefully this will be a backdrop for some of the work that you'll do following. As I mentioned, the kind of core principles of scenario planning, taking a long view. I know this is focused on the short, long view of fall, which may seem a long time from now after the summer, but typically scenario planning, when I first started, it was 10 years out. Now 3 years out feels like a long time. It's this outside-in approach that we talked about, looking at the driving forces in the external environment to say, how might that impact learning? How might that impact our school? And ultimately thinking about multiple perspectives. So one thing, if you take nothing away from this webinar, perhaps you want to think about who else should we get in this process. That may include students, that may include teachers, that may include colleagues from a different place, that may include technologists. So that in and of itself would be so valuable. So I'll just fast forward here. So one of these kind of external driving forces that of course is on everybody's mind right now is this wonderment about the duration and intensity of the pandemic. Right? Is this going to be long and drawn out, or is this going to be shorter that we'll be able to navigate through relatively quickly? So in order to make that abstract big question more concrete, we can create two axes that really identifies, this is the critical thinking part. What would drive it to be shorter and more mild? Well, testing becomes more available, abundant, and reliable. Antiviral treatments become available. Vaccines get fast-tracked. Healthcare systems receive the equipment that they need. We can see this. Any one of these are plausible. They may not be happening. They may not be probable. There may be some areas where they're more equipped, but we could see each one of these as a specific element that would drive the pandemic to be shorter and more milder. And of course, that's what we all hope for. On the flip side, we could also see that this pandemic becomes longer and more intense. And of course, we're seeing some experts talk about the second wave, talk about how that this is going to hit more vulnerable populations. Certainly the new news that we're seeing about this hitting our young people in unexpected ways is very, very troubling for many of us. We're seeing testing come out to be not as reliable as we hope that it might be. So we certainly don't want to ignore the fact that we have emotion about this, that we don't want this to be this way, but it is a possibility. And we don't want to be blindsided by the fact that there are some elements that might exasperate the intensity of this pandemic. So that's one driving force. On the flip side, another one that's on the top of our minds right now is the depth and the length of the economic impacts. Of course, it's related to the pandemic, but it is in fact separate. So here we can see on the one hand, deep and lasting impact, economic impact. Again, none of us want this, but it's important to look at it with an objective viewpoint to say, you know what, this is and may lead to widespread loss of an income and employment, certainly uneven at best, right? Devastation of certain sectors particularly hit hard by this, like offline retail. Local businesses, what's the impact of that? That schools continue to stay shut. And I know many of us are monitoring. What are some of the early signals that are suggesting that some schools are not willing to go back to being in person in the fall? So on the hopeful side, we can sort of hope that the stimulus, that the government response, that the way that the social sector and the way that we are actually seeing cross-sector collaboration might actually help buoy the economy, help us give us lift. And we're starting to see some cautious reopening, and the partnerships have just been extraordinary. So this may not be on your radar, but this is happening. And so one thought is, who could you bring into your conversation to make sure that you are staying abreast of some of these things? So if we put these two external driving forces together, we can see 4 futures play out. So we could see a sort of return to normal-ish is what I'm calling, because the more that this goes on, the more we're seeing that it's really not even going to be normal. And as Laura said earlier, we may not want it to go to normal. We want to maybe return to better. If we see a shorter duration of the pandemic, but the slower economic recovery, we might say a constrained environment and how that might play out. So we could see some elements of what we know, but it would have to be administered or distributed differently. Of course, the bottom left is not a scenario that any of us hope for, of a collapse scenario where things go awry. And the bottom right, we can maybe hope for a transformational scenario where perhaps we do have a longer duration of the pandemic, but we are able to see those transformative processes. And it was so interesting to hear in the Senate testimonial a couple of days ago, Lamar Alexander, I believe, talked about this lollipop test that we might hope for in the future. So we could see breakthroughs that we can hope come to life more quickly. So, and one way, just kind of modeling something I'd said earlier about bringing these futures to life, because words can sometimes get lost on people. Sometimes what we do in futures is we create iconic images to really create an indelible impression of what the future holds. And here in the upper right, you could see labs coming to life. And certainly I know at Stanford, that is a priority that they've identified, that they're really hoping to get the in-person mandatory learning that needs to happen back as soon as possible in safe ways. And of course, you could see the upper left, where we see restaurants, but very, very different. I've seen some early prototypes of restaurants, for example, or even classrooms that have like a lot more dividers, a lot more plastic, different kind of gear that allows us to enjoy some of the face-to-face, but in a safe way. The bottom left, we see the horrible sights of these growing food banks and pressure on social services. The bottom left, that is, and the bottom right, perhaps we're going to see drone delivery, something that would really flex our imagination. So this is just one way. It's a very long illustrated example of how we can start to think about those external drivers to inform the conversations that we're having.
Great. Thanks, Lisa. There's a couple more questions. And as a lot of K-12 and myself being a former principal and a teacher, we want to know what it looks like, right? So and a lot of the questions are like, how do we help schools embrace this type of thinking? Right now there's a great opportunity to think about multiple futures. Kristen talks about there's some amazing momentum right now. So how do we get into this? Another person is asking, as a small rural school, how do I get my staff to embrace this type of thinking? And so in your work, where have you seen organizations or schools that are really embracing this type of futures thinking work?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And it's going to be different for your local context. And here I'm going to really emphasize the importance of leaning into your design skills of empathy, right? So you need to understand what is the entry point to have a conversation about something that may be new and unfamiliar to your leaders or your stakeholders. I would not suggest coming back from this webinar or an article be like, hey, everyone, we're going to do futures thinking, and that is going to save the day, right? Your futures cape. The thing about futures thinking, when you start to introduce the concept of having a strategic conversation about something that is inherently unknowable or includes uncertainty, we have to understand that that shuts down a lot of folks that feel nervous and that feel uncomfortable being asked, in essence, to be masters at something they've never had time to practice. And we know this, right? We know this from the neuroscience that says that as humans, we are wired to like certainty. That's why we hold on to those strategic plans and forecasts so dearly, because they give us this sense of certainty. So I really want you to think very carefully about what is the opening question that would allow a conversation about the future that is imaginative, that is exploratory, that allows everyone to embrace a learner's mindset, not a performance mindset. Because going back to what I said earlier, we cannot know what the future holds, but we can all participate in imagining the range of futures and how it may play out. So all good futures processes starts with a great focal question, a great framed question, future oriented, that gets at a curiosity about how those external forces might unfold and really allows people to feel like they can engage in the process of some of that discovery about those futures and about the pattern recognition and then bringing those futures to life.
Great. And there's a question from Rosa about, is futures thinking and scenario planning about what we call divergent thinking and convergent thinking? And as someone who I'm a very divergent thinker, as you know, can you talk a little bit about, as my colleague Ariel is laughing, can you talk a little bit about how futures thinking really combines the best of those, and how does convergence thinking and divergent thinking exist within scenario planning?
Oh, such a great question. Yes, 1,000% yes. And again, if you are going to be running this process, part of your awareness needs to be to communicate to the team, which part are you in, right? Because we know we love to converge, we love to get to next steps and to right answers. And this conversation in particular asks that you hold strong ideas lightly, asks that you stay in that divergent moment until it's ready to actually come to a convergent moment. And let me give you a specific example. So as we think about both the driving forces, right? Like what could they be? That is a divergent moment where you're trying to get lots of ideas. Then when you're trying to articulate, well, what are the two that really matter, the highest uncertainty, highest impact? That's a convergent moment. That's where you're really narrowing in. Then you put those two together and you're fleshing out those futures. And this, I want to suggest, is just one way to do futures thinking and scenario planning. There are some others. So when you put that 2 by 2 together, like I showed you, so now you're thinking about divergent thinking within that future. What are some headlines we might see in that future? What are some conditions of that future? Who's doing well in that future? We don't know for sure. We're asking you to lead into it. And then when we say, once we've fleshed out, for example, those 4 futures, you want to come back to strategic implications. You want to say, okay, we've explored these 4 futures. What's robust? What's something that will happen amongst any one of these futures? That's a convergent thinking. That's a strategic decision-making moment. Where do we want to make bets? How do we understand which of these futures is more plausible? Okay, now we're again identifying what's the experimentation that will then take us on yet another path of divergent, convergent thinking. So it is, you're toggling between the two. And that's why it's really helpful, and it's so wonderful to see so many people interested in this topic, because we need a community of practice. And Laura knows I wake up every day thinking, how can I scale this community of practice? How can we take some of these techniques that frankly have been around for decades, starting with strategic planning in the 50s with the Rand Corporation, to make them more accessible to, as Laura said, really the future shapers, which are you, right? All of you that are creating conditions in your school to allow that to cascade down to teachers and ultimately students.
Great. I think that's a nice segue, and I want to thank you, Lisa, for sharing your insights. Ariel's going to share my screen, or his screen, so we can run through our next bit. But I just want to echo that, is that so much, I think, in education, and all of us have experienced, is that we receive information, whether it's testing, it's the skill sets that we're supposed to teach. And yet I think this is a great opportunity right now to really, for all of us as students, as school leaders, and as educators, to shape the future we want to have in schools. We are seeing this as there are great challenges that we're facing, and there are great opportunities in both ends. And we really need to use this opportunity as we go into fall 2020 to mitigate those challenges and really leverage the opportunities to shape what I hope is a more preferable future for our young people. So I'm just gonna, as a teacher and someone who likes to like synthesize, I'm gonna share some kind of final thinking and think about what this looks like in practice. So I kind of took some of Lisa's thinking and put them into a couple mindsets that we might do as a takeaway for everyone. So quickly, what we're going to be doing for the rest of the call is sharing a little bit about how you can actually bring this thinking and practice to life in your context. Ariel will be walking us through a Mural board, which is a collaborative online technology tool that you can use with your staff in a remote conditions to actually run through this. And we'll do that at the end of the call, so you'll see how to facilitate that. But as it would behoove of us to remind us of like, what are the key mindsets as facilitators that we want to bring to this work when we're engaging in the facilitation process. So I'm going to share a few things that we think are really important as kind of key takeaways as K-12 educators. First, as Lisa said, we really must, and it came up in the chat, cultivating an equitable lens, right? How do we ensure that we're cultivating an equitable lens when we're doing this work? And for me, that brings back really thinking about how we do really learning with the people within our community. So Ariel, if you want to go to the next slide. For us, what that looks like is, again, as Lisa said, creating empathy. And I will say that we think about how do we learn with students and within their own context. And so first and foremost, what are we hearing from our students? How would we know? What platforms are you going to hear their authentic voice? Are you calling them? Are we doing listening circles? How are you taking time to listen to the community? Is that a survey? Is that a call? Is that a walk? Where are we actually finding the time to just listen, not only to what they're saying, but how they're feeling? We know that learning, of course, is about emotions. And so how do we address the emotions that our students are feeling first and foremost? And how are they telling us about that? Next is thinking about immersion. How are students experiencing the classes? I spent time on a Zoom call. Are we dropping in just like we did before and going into classes? What is the type of learning that they are experiencing? What are the type of learning that they're choosing to experience? My nephew spends about 6 hours a day online playing video games. Why is that interesting? What's going on there? What can we learn from the immersive activities that our students are choosing to engage with? And what does that suggest about the possibilities for education? And lastly, what does professional development feel like right now? How are we staying connected? How are we leaning into the strengths? How are people revealing themselves as my friend Ariel, who never probably thought of himself as a technology person, background on Mural, has becoming our Mural master within the K-12 lab? How are people showing up in different ways, and how are we leveraging the strength of our staff and really elevating and celebrating that? And lastly, what are we seeing from our students' work? What are they producing? What are they not producing? What is the quality of work that we hope to have in this moment? And then the last two, which is again coming up in our chat, is what behaviors are becoming routine right now? Who's having access, who doesn't? And what systems are we replicating? I was talking to a school the other day and they continue to have the same bell schedule. Is that a system we want to continue to replicate? I've talked to some teachers and they have the same teaching load for next year. They have 6 classes or 5 classes they're preparing for. Is that a system we want to continue to replicate, or are ways around heavily thinking about that? And then nextly, thinking about how do we shape? And so I want to share a couple, we really think it's important to start people stepping into the future and having them start to shape the mindsets. And so we'll share a couple activities. For example, Lisa shared the headline. And so we shared this question at our Futures Fest this past fall. So how might we design the future together? And we shared a couple headlines with our entire community to walk us into the future. So first one is the year 2030. Each school in your hometown is equipped with what? That was just a great entry point to like what is actually happening in our community. Another one that we looked at was the principal of your local high school just sent this tweet. What has just happened? What can we imagine happening with our communities? And lastly, students in your local school just won an award for that. For what? So we have a couple more examples, of course, that we can share with you, but these headlines that we try to create for K-12 are helping us walk to the future. to help imagine what is possible. And you could imagine 10 of these, 5 of these, but there's space to imagine what is possible, to unearth how people are feeling about the future and what are the challenges and what are the possibilities. And then, of course, as Lisa said, it's really important to think about how do we bias this toward collaboration? How do we share this work routinely and with a diverse group of people? So the next one is really creating with diversity. I think that we think about, often for me, it's really about how we will include the diverse and, really important, the invisible voices in the planning process. Who are the students that we're not hearing from? Who are the parents that we're not hearing from? How do we get their voice involved in this is really important for us. How do we design with them and ensure that those voices and those insights are not left out in the planning process? And then lastly, of course, is how do we continue to share the scenario ideas with the broader community early and often? And lastly, framing the big picture. How are you going to explain what is for sure going to happen, what is certain right now, and then what's up for creation? What do we know is actually certain? For example, we think about our school missions. We know we're going to offer a high quality education for our young people. That is a certainty, right? We know we're going to ensure that every kid has a caring adult who's going to reach out to them in their community. That is a certainty. How do we do that is up for creation. So how do we really think about that? And then, of course, how will you challenge the assumptions of what school could be right now? All of us, I know many of us are really thinking about how do we really think about creating a new schedule that is humane? And how do we really think about what school could look like right next year for our staff, for our parents, and for our teachers? There is no question that many of us are feeling a strong digital fatigue right now, right? And how do we really thinking about, are we just replicating the same systems, or can we actually play and create some new systems in our schools that serve the young people even better than we did before? And that's a big task. There's no question that we have the answers, but it's a question that we need to continue to go back to. And the next one, thanks. And so really thinking about how we ensure that we're creating an equitable lens, how are we really helping people walk to the future, and how are we ensuring that we're collaborating, particularly with people that are often left out of the system. That for us is always at our core when we're thinking about K-12 education for us. So those are the things that we're thinking about as you embrace this process of facilitating this type of learning with your students and with your parents and with your broader community. So I'm going to kick it now to Ariel, who's going to talk a little bit about what this could look like in your own context.
Okay, great. Let me just unpin your video here and we'll get ready to go. So everybody should be able to see me. Yep. Okay. So my job, I have maybe the dubious honor here of following up Lisa and Laura, who I think we led with like 2 rounds of dessert, delicious, like amazing dessert. And now you're gonna get some vegetables. But these vegetables are really good and they're really gonna help you envision from this high level, how would you actually do this, right? Like this, I think theoretical content is rich, it's really good. It's helped us start to imagine ways that we can move ahead. Yet, like, you've got staff and you've got students, teachers, community members, and you're wondering, okay, how do I actually put this into practice? That's what I'm gonna offer you here. So I'm gonna be in this slide deck for just a moment, and then I'm actually gonna switch over to a browser that will help show the different tools that we'll be using and that you can use yourself in order to pull this off. So let's go. So this is kind of the headline, right? This is probably the 3 things that you'll want to do in order to get ready. We're going to be sharing some resources with you. One is a school mural that you'll be able to use just by yourself, right? So that one, we sent out a different version of a mural. We're going to share a new one later today that will give you some more powers that we'll go into in a little bit. There's also a facilitation mural that you will have access to that gives suggested instructions for what to do at every stage. So those together are really helpful to review. And then you can use Zoom as your sort of chat space. Once you review those resources, I really recommend practicing facilitation, even if it's minor. One of the first things I did once we went into shelter in place is like reserved an hour with my wife. I had her computer, my computer, and both of our phones with Zoom available, just so that I could understand what was happening on the second, third, and fourth screens when I was sharing my screen. So doing all that with the complicating factor of Mural, this other technology, is really going to help you. So find somebody in your house or bribe a friend, get as many screens as you have access to up, and tinker. And then lastly, you want to prepare your team. And when you go to schedule out the eventual work that you're going to do, inflate that time by a little bit, especially in the first session, because things, you know, might go a little bit more funky than your controlled environment. So you do need to accommodate for that. Okay, so these are the 5 activities that Laura kind of went into, and now I'm going to take you into the kind of mural that will show what these look like. So those tips will come in a little bit. I'm going to stop this share, and I'm going to head and go into my Firefox here. So everybody should be able to see, this is kind of the mural page. All right, so let me just make one point before we get distracted by the fancy technology. So in the kind of like cooking show metaphor, what I'm doing right here is I'm like pulling the lasagna out of the oven and it's ready, okay? And then I'm gonna take you back a little bit and show you how to like layer in the pasta and the sauce. So first, this is like the fully baked mural, which will, that you will then create. And the steps to create it are really not that very complicated. We've streamlined that for you. And I see some questions in the chat. Mural there's a 30-day free trial that just like got extended to 90 days. Presumably, you're going to be doing a lot of this scenario planning in the next few weeks. So I think that amount of time will really work for what we need to do. But one really critical point, if your trial is about to expire, make sure you export all the murals you've done work on, so you at least have those as a PDF. Okay, so back to the mural. So this is our facilitation mural that has been kind of designed in order for it to be workable. And there are basically 2 layers on here. The reason why I mention that is because all of these elements here, like this text, these images, these are locked, okay? I can't move those and you won't be able to move those. We made those for you. What you can do is take these Post-its and move them around, and you can type in them, right? So I could put my name in here. I should know how to spell my own name. And then, and that is how you'll basically be using it. The functionality here, especially from your colleagues' perspectives who are going to be doing this with you, is really simple. And as you can see, if I zoom out of the mural just a little bit, there are suggestions and guides that kind of take you through what each activity is and break it down for you and your colleagues, okay? So I'm gonna do a solid walkthrough of all of these pieces in just a moment. But before I do that, I just wanna show you what you need to do in order to make this happen, okay? So, so this is a mural room, right? I have a few of the facilitation murals already created. I'm gonna just create a blank mural, okay? And now what I'm gonna do is drop in the image that you will get from us in an email. So you haven't gotten this yet, but we're gonna send it later today at the end of this call. As you can see, this image is being uploaded and it's gonna come out really small. And this image is basically the entire scenario planning process that I just showed you, right? So you can see it there, it's itty bitty, and we just wanna make this bigger. So I'm just gonna drag it into the corner and make it go in here. And I'm just gonna make this much, much bigger. Looks like I have to zoom in order to get that to crop up. Okay, so now it's bigger, bigger, bigger. I'm gonna zoom out. I just need to do this a few more times. And it is pretty important that you stretch this out. I will explain why in just a second, but it's it'll be easier to kind of stay organized if you stretch this out to be a bit bigger. So I'll just go a little bit further here. And that should be good. All right, so now we can zoom in here. Yeah, there's kind of a plus and a minus here in Zoom if you want to get into all the elements and be able to read what's available there for you. Okay, so now the next step after you've stretched out this image, and actually let me just stretch it a little bit more so it's at the end of this mural. Cool. And I'll just extend the size of this mural. This digital whiteboard is really handy because you can use it really quickly and it does not take very much time to learn. Okay, all right, so I'm done stretching it. Now, what is gonna happen is you're gonna be using this digital whiteboard with 3, 10, 20 people, and people start to get around in it and they'll move things. And then this will come over here and it can become a hot mess, and that's hard to anticipate. So the key thing to do here is to just lock it. And I'm gonna say only facilitators can lock. So I'm a facilitator. I'm the only person who can lock this. I'll just rename this webinar test. And I'm actually gonna share it with my colleague, Laura. And Laura, if you wanna hop in there, we'll see you in just a second. Okay, so go ahead, Laura. You should have that in your email. Okay, so that's like, you've completed the lion's share of the prep required in order to get this to go. The only thing you wanna do now is, you see how it says place blank post-its here? We put that on purpose. And you'll see it in a few other places here, as well as later on in the right. What I suggest you do is just place a blank post-it from the toolkit. If that doesn't work for you, you can also just double click. If you double click, you get a post-it. And the important thing here is to resize your post-it. And this is why we stretched out the image. See right there, 40 by 40, that's the smallest size that Mural will allow. So if you haven't stretched it out, your post-it size relative to your mural is gonna be so massive that you won't be able to edit it. So Laura, I see yours is a little big down there at the bottom. So maybe if you can get it to the minimum size as well. And then you can copy and paste these post-its. You can copy and paste these post-its. You can select multiple and copy and paste it. Okay, now I have a bunch here. So why do we do that? As you saw, Laura just went in there and made a new post-it, and her post-it was like super big. And when you have 10, 20 people on here, for whatever reason, people's post-its are of different sizes. And then all of these templates that we've created become incredibly disorganized. And there are these like post-it hogs that make it hard to track. So by creating these here, now I can write my name and drag it down. And it looks at about the same size, and we can all be in here and be kind of happy and organized, okay? Cool. So that is what you'll need to do in order to set your mural up. So the recap is, you register for Mural, you create a blank mural, you upload our image, stretch it out, lock it, and add these post-its. And then the reason why we want to do that, I think many of you have joined murals that we created in the past. What we realize is the way that Mural is set up, we can't make you facilitators of that. And then you are now kind of beholden to our mural space, and you have limited capability in terms of sharing it with your team and then being able to edit it afterwards. And that's just not as good for you. We want to give you maximum flexibility here. And so that's why we created this whole system. Okay. So we've set up the blank mural. You know, now you've got your kind of lasagna fully baked, and now it's time to serve it for dinner. So this is what I recommend you do. So I just hopped over from the mural that I made to the facilitation mural. And again, you're all going to receive this facilitation mural. What makes it a facilitation mural? Well, if you go to this top toolbar over here, you'll see that there's an outline. You click on that, and you can actually click on each of these elements, and it'll take you to that space in the mural. And as you can see, we went in and we gave a pretty decent explanation of how to facilitate each of these activities. So you've got it right in there, and you can kind of use this as a resource in order to understand how you might facilitate this activity, as well as the background to it. So there's a lot there that can just get you up and running so you know how to facilitate each of these individual steps. And there's also number 6 over here. There's the important note about setting up the post-it. So if this video weren't enough, you've also got a note in there that gives you suggestions for how to do that. Okay, I'm just gonna stop sharing for a moment and check in with the chat because I see there's a little bit of activity there. And then if there are any questions I need to answer, I just wanna scan this quickly. So can you add teachers as participants and not facilitators? Yes. So you as the facilitator have control over that. And you can also make them facilitators, which can be nice if you wanted to shift the role. You know, let's say you have somebody on your team who can coordinate the tech and will allow you to be more of a speaker. So you can have control over that. The reason why we ran into trouble is that the Mural restrictions are like controlled by your organization. So basically, in order to make you facilitators, we would have to give you all a d.school email address. And as much as we would like to do that, it would be a tough burden on our colleague Bruce. So that's why we had to create this whole new system. Laura, were there any other questions here that I should address before moving forward? The chat, how do you?
I'll keep monitoring the chat as you go through, which is what I'm doing. So you can keep running through. I think that we're going to give you one thing I will say, Mural, is some people have used it and some people haven't. Once you dive into it as someone, it is a pretty self-explanatory. You play with it a little bit. It is pretty intuitive. But I think to some point, like, this is really a tool for conversation. You know, it's helping people walk through some possible thinkings as they jump through. So I think as you go through it, speak a little bit about, I think, not just what the tool is, but then where's the conversation, which is really the core of all this, of like what learning might be as people think about moving forward and what that is.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much. I'd be happy to. So there was just one question in there about the outline. So I'll show how to do that real quick. So we have our Mural here, and then at the very top, there's a toolbar. And this toolbar, if you go to the right, there's a comments, there's activity, and then there's outline. So you just click on that and it pulls it up. Okay, so that's how you get to it. What I'm now gonna do, let me address Laura's point, and then I'll actually do kind of a walkthrough of the different parts of this Mural so you understand the series of activities. So the Mural is a tool for interaction, right? It's a tool to have this conversation and also catalog it so that we can track the thoughts and the ideas and develop them further along, because we will want to develop some of these ideas both from an operational perspective of, okay, how do we build a schedule for that, as well as a communication perspective, right? How do we communicate now with parents who may not have been part of this process, but want to know, what are you doing to plan for uncertainty at our school? How did you arrive at the decisions you made, right? They may really benefit from that whole decision-making process. We think of you using 2 technologies while you have this scenario planning experience. It can be a chat space, which could be Zoom, but it could also be a phone call, a group phone call. And then it's a workspace, which we're suggesting Mural, and we've built that out for you, but you could just as well do this in a Google Doc. It won't look as vibrant, perhaps, but it does give you that same ability of interaction. So if this technology feels burdensome for you, don't lose sight of just making a simpler adaptation. And it's really about the conversation and the ideas, not about Mural and Zoom. Okay, with that being said, over here, I'm just gonna do a walkthrough. Over here is just a little description of the work that we've done and some framing around how to use this tool. You'll notice it does say part 1 at the top. We are working on creating a second Mural. We've prioritized creating this one here so that we could make it available for this webinar, but we'll create another one and be in touch with you as soon as it's available. Moving to step number 1. So this game, this futures game, goes to the point that Lisa made around diversity and having diversity of thought on your team. What we ask you to do here is to write, very simple, is to write your name on a Post-it like I've done here, and then plot yourself where you believe you rank on this spectrum. So I, for example, individuals influence the future or collective forces influence the future. I think it's collective forces, I will say. And am I optimistic about where the world is headed? I would say that I'm, maybe 3 months ago, I was optimistic up here. In the current moment, I'm still optimistic. Maybe I would say I'm a little bit lower just because of the intensity of the current times, but I still carry some optimism. So that's where I would rank myself here. And what you'll do, and Laura, if you want to plot yourself here as well, you'll spend a few minutes just to get people comfortable with that, and then have them plot themselves somewhere and open it up to conversation. What this does is expose the bias we already carry in our attitudes towards the future. And that bias, I know bias is of course a word with negative connotation. In this context, it's actually really good to expose that bias, because what it allows you to know is like, these people's attitudes are quite different. That can create diversity on your team in terms of how you approach the thinking that happens later. So, this is kind of a critical formative activity to start with. And another reason why we started this with this activity is because it allows you to learn the basic functionality of Mural, right? You just write something on a Post-it and then you bring that down. That's what folks are going to be asked to do at all the other places. So we thought it was good kind of double activity for that reason. Okay, great. So once you do that, I would suggest you have a little bit of a dialogue about people's attitudes, just to expose that in conversation. That can take 10, 15 minutes. Then you would hop to who we are. And this will help you just get grounded on who you are as an organization, thinking about your missions, your values, and your impact. And we like to think of this as kind of an abstraction, right? So when you're thinking about your impact, go to the level of what you do for the people you serve, and think with fewer constraints around, we're a school, right? We're a physical school, because having more of an open-ended perspective will help you there. But we do think it is helpful to at least understand who you are as a collective and what your strengths are. We put 10 minutes here in terms of the activity. It could take a bit longer based on how much conversation you have, of course. The way that I like to facilitate it is kind of people populate quietly for a couple of minutes. I might play some music in the background, then we have a conversation, then we hop to the next one, populate quietly, music in the background, have a conversation, and so on. And that structure of kind of silent writing followed by a share out is one that I think really works for facilitating with Mural. So that's something that you'll see repeated elsewhere. Before I go to the next section, I see that there's a little bit activity in the chat. Laura, if there's anything in there, you can go ahead and interrupt me and I'll take a brief pause.
Someone's asked me how many people, and I think it's a question in some of the versions. Of course, you can have in the free version is unlimited anonymous guests. And if, as you jump in, you can have free unlimited guests. I think it's less about the number of people. You could make multiple copies of this Mural, right? You could duplicate it. I think one of the things I would think about is when we have done this, I think our cap within some of this is about 20 to 30 people is probably the most number of people I've seen on one Mural, just because you got a lot of people moving around. So if you're thinking about using this, let's say with 50 people, I would actually just think about duplicating it and then making smaller groups, that are utilizing the same template, but in smaller groups, partly because it is about the conversation and you really want to have the dialogue around this. So we have found when we're doing these types of work is that it's really important, 10 people actually working in a Zoom room, right? Is a good kind of number that we feel like we can facilitate. They can all be on the same Mural, let's say if 30 people, but you would actually set up different breakout rooms for, 10, 10, 10. So you're really prefacing dialogue, right? Not just people looking on the Mural. So think about, again, this question of equitable dialogue. It's really about the conversations and the assumptions, as Kristen was saying, that are coming up that you really want to call out as people start kind of putting ideas up into this, into the mural.
So thanks for that, Laura. Actually, let me stop the share and just explain this one point, and then we'll go back into it. There's some questions about the outline and the murals that we've shared, so let me just underline this. We have not shared this current mural with you at all. We just wanted to showcase it here, and we're featuring it. We intentionally have not invited you to it because we really needed to sort out the details. The D.school has a long history of kind of like refining and perfecting experiences and tools before sharing that with the public. I will say, because of the urgency in the moment, we moved a bit faster than we're used to, as well as like with new technology. So there for sure were some growing pains. But the important point is you're gonna get all of this, right? You're gonna get this image that you can use to create your own mural, and you're gonna get the facilitation mural. The facilitation mural will be locked. You will not be like able to kind of edit it, and that's on purpose. Please don't edit it because it's for everyone, right? And then you can go into your own mural, and if you want to make changes, you'll have the freedom to do that. Okay, so back to the shared screen. So this step here, you know, you'll might immediately be struck that this is reminiscent of the framework that Lisa shared, though with some changes, right? There's some difference here. And that's because we were thinking specifically about schools, as well as broadly about an international scope. And that's because we know we have schools from all over the world who are interested in this work. And Lisa was especially sharing about an American governmental context, because as we were creating those scenario plans, that was what was relevant, you know, to the work that we're doing at Stanford with the D.school. So what we thought about is effective mitigation on the y-axis and spread on the x-axis. And we came up with what we thought are three-ish or four scenarios, depending on how you think about it, right? So at the top right, you have low spread and effective mitigation. That means you can likely open your campus. It won't be 100% business as usual, but you will be able to open your campus, let's say to the great majority of students and faculty. On the other side, effective mitigation but high spread, you'll likely have to do some hybrid learning model. We had this as blended learning in a previous version, and I realized because blended has such a specific education connotation, hybrid works a little bit better. On the bottom, you might have high spread and ineffective mitigation, right? This is probably the worst public health outcome, to be honest. And what you'll likely have to do is extend the remote learning that many, if not all of you are doing right now. And then in the bottom right, you have low spread and ineffective mitigation. That's probably in a situation of a lot of uncertainty because of the ineffective mitigation, which means you may, as a safety mechanism, have to defer to hybrid learning as well. So that's why hybrid learning kind of repeats in there. Below here, you'll see there are 3 descriptions of each of these. I'm not going to read those right now. Those are available for you to look at, but they just click into that a little bit more and give you some more details, okay? And the thing to say is, well, hybrid learning, it does show up here twice. It also has likely many more permutations than the other model. So that's another thing to consider, especially as you prototype later on. Okay, so I'm just gonna zoom out for a second, and you see 1, 2, 3. There are 3 tools here, but they're the same tool, right? The text has changed a little bit in terms of the color. You can see I kind of shifted that, but this is meant for you to explore each of these 3 futures. So the open campus, hybrid learning, extended remote learning, you'll see if you zoom in that this here, ooh, that's a little too aggressive. This is open campus, and the one on the right will be hybrid learning. And then of course, on the far right, you'll have the last one. There is some variability here in terms of how you facilitate. We include that in this gray box. If you are a large group, as Laura was mentioning, you could do this in 3 separate breakout spaces and have people go from top to bottom. If you're a smaller group, you may benefit from just going through it as a whole group. Likely the first time you go through it, it'll take maybe 45 minutes, maybe an hour. And then in the second and third visits to the future, it'll likely take you a little less time. Okay, so and then a walkthrough of this tool. This is just some grounding in what this future looks like that we would ask you to read. So it'd be a nice moment to have someone else read out loud if you've been doing a lot of the facilitation. You can start to add to that here. If you wanted to be fancy, which those of you who know me know that I do, you can also change this color to match the color that's in this scenario. What you do is you imagine headlines for the future and you'll type them in and kind of bring it down. So this is an open campus. So this might be a fairly optimistic future. So I'll say a headline might be vaccine invented, right? And then if I think down here about the timeline, you know, that might happen down here. And then later on, you know, my father, Dr. Raz, he wins the Nobel Prize. So I can say Dr. Raz wins Nobel Prize, right? Yeah, that's how you spell Nobel Prize, right? So that would be a headline that comes in over here. Note that this is not education focused yet, right? We're thinking about headlines across the world. So there's been a tendency to really focus on K-12. You're going to do that in just a moment. So kind of hold that as you continue to go down. This allows you to really visit and understand that future. And now we're going to plunge into needs. And you see that there are these circles here, 4 circles that kind of get smaller in size, though not smaller in importance. We're thinking about the larger needs. What are the needs for society? We're thinking about the school needs. What are the needs for the school? And then we're going more specific into student needs, teacher needs. You know, I might even down here, I might even grab a text box and write parent needs as a way to make sure I'm capturing that voice as well, because they may have unique needs. But same thing here, you know, spend a few minutes letting folks create needs on their own quietly and then share them. And as they are being shared, you may want to actually move the Post-its around so that they're grouped. So once you've done that, the last part over here asks you, how might you create impact in this world? This feels more like a brainstorm, right? This is echoing the language about impact that we heard earlier and asking you, okay, you visited this world, you've understood it, you've thought about headlines, so you see it over a certain time frame. Now, how might you create impact? What are the ideas that you can bring to bear? Should feel like an ideation session. And then one thing that you can do is if you have a bunch of ideas here, I'll just demonstrate this quickly, you can actually go in and enable voting. And this is one of the reasons why you want to be a facilitator, because this is really helpful for sorting. And let me say, this works way better on Mural than it's ever worked for me in person, which is one really nice feature of the technology. Right, so then I can kind of begin voting. I voted twice. I can end voting. I've ended it for everyone. And now what's nice is that, my voting results, I know there's nothing written here, but the results that have been voted on will actually become visible to you, and then you can kind of group them. I'm not sure why it's not happening right now, but maybe just a glitch. Okay, so it's because other people are voting. So let me just zoom out here. We want to close in just a second with Mural. I'll just recap and help us finish up. Remember, there are 3 of these, right? So the process is the same across 1, 2, 3. So we don't need to go over these other 2. And then the last section here just asks you to debrief. As a result of visiting this future, what questions does this raise for you? What are you going to monitor more closely? That's really important because that might be a key to whether this future is coming to be. And then how might you learn more? What further steps do we need to take as an organization or as an individuals in order to be better equipped for managing this future? Okay. I'm going to stop share in just a second. Keep in mind, there's a pretty robust outline written here, so you can refer to that. Again, we will send it soon. And then this video will also be available for you to kind of pause and play and jump through as much as you need. You can play it at 1.5 times speed. You can play it at 70% speed so that you understand all these various steps and set up your mural and facilitate effectively. Okay. With that being said, I'm going to take my breath. And then Laura, have you gathered any questions for us here?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple things. I think as you see, just from a mindset perspective, if you walk through kind of the mural itself, right? The first activity is just getting people familiar with Mural and spending some light time doing that. The second activity, the futures game, is getting people to think about what is people's affect toward the future, right? Our attitudes and our emotions toward the future impact our design work. And I've done this many times with folks on Mural and in person. And it's a good indicator, especially when you're working with, those of you who are thinking about working with board members and obviously community members, just getting people's sense of how they feel about the future is important because it leads to their design work and how they shape the design work they're going to do. So as you start with that piece, and then there is this like flaring, right? The divergence piece of like what this world could look like. And as you go through, you get into a much more focused area, which is what might we do? So as you think about this kind of step-by-step process, it is about exploring Mural, exploring what you think about the future, really doing some divergent thinking about what are the driving forces within each of these scenarios, and given that, what might we do in your learning communities to create a new preferable future, not replicating just what we did before. So those are kind of, I think, the headers. And as you'll see from the outline, it's a pretty robust facilitation, obviously guide, and we will continue to update the Mural, just so you know, as people test it and drive it like we all do as designers. So we will probably as we make changes to, and we hear great insights from our friends that are facilitating on this call, we'll update it so we can make it, of course, a more robust and more refined asset as we go forward. So if you are having, challenge with this, please let us know. But we do see this Mural is just really a conversation. If the Mural is not going to work for you, if it feels like, wow, I can't handle it, you can take the content and switch it to a Google Doc, right? Or a Google slide deck. It's really not about the tech ever. It's just about the conversation that you want to have with people, and how do you visualize that conversation. We happen to use Mural because it visualizes the things people are saying and allows people to get their thoughts up equitably on a board where everyone's ideas can be heard. And if we're thinking about a collective future and how we bring all our voices in, how do you continue to create a platform for all voices to be heard in this uncertain future? As Lisa said, people are feeling uncertain. And I think having your voice heard in your community lessens the uncertainty, right? Being heard and being seen is an important part of designing for the future with your community. And although you may not be able to mitigate the fear, ensuring that people actually are heard is a step forward to that. So we're going to wrap up.
So yeah, let me just share a couple of things real quick. What happens next from this Mural is you want to probably think about some prototypes. So there are next steps. This is just meant to be the first session. We'll headline those for you in an email. The other thing to note is that, and I'm going to put this in in the shared, there we go, slide deck, is that these are the next steps, right? Check your email, look for what you see from us, and then update your Mural as needed. We also are offering a facilitated course of this. And if that's something you're interested in, please sign up. We're going to do our first one on Friday. That's a week from today. And then we are opening up other courses if there is interest. So we're super happy to do more of a facilitated experience with you. It's about 9 hours long in terms of how it's structured for our shared time together. There was a question on the chat about summarizing the data on Mural. And one thing that we're offering in the course are also some slide decks that can help you think about each scenario plan, think about the schedule that might be suitable there, what professional learning considerations you have. So there really is a nice kind of robust series of resources that will follow that facilitated course. If that's not something that's available to you, we will create another mural that we'll send out, as well as give you kind of tips for how we would see you doing this after the first experience. But the hope was really to just be able to give you enough context as well as tools to get started as soon as you can, because we know there's so much urgency out there. So we hope this call has been helpful for you. And we really do appreciate you sharing your time with us. And we look forward to hearing more about what you do with this work. And we greatly admire everything that you do every day for teachers, for students, for parents, and for our community of learners around the world. This is our email if you have further questions, k12@dschool.stanford.edu. And with that, I think we will close out. Laura, am I missing anything?
No, I just want to thank you all. You've given us your time, and we just appreciate you so much. My last and foremost is just like, as we design forward, is thinking about what can we create now that we couldn't create before. There is a great opportunity to mitigate some of the equity issues that we have seen. And I hope that we can really utilize this moment to really imagine a future that our students really deserve. And if we can do that, then I think we're taking a step forward. So with all of you, we wish you good luck. Feel free to connect with us. We'll stay on, of course, after this call. There's some people that want to connect and make new friends. So we'll stay on the call, of course, to take kind of lingering questions. But for those who have to go, we thank you for your time, and feel free to send us questions and emails. And for my friends who I haven't seen in a while, Stephanie, Morgan, Derry, Patrice, folks that I haven't seen in a while, we miss you, we love you, and we're glad you're here. And I look forward to meeting all of you at one point in person at some point in the distant future, and we can all see, and we'd love to hear your stories, of course, of how this goes. So thank you so much.
All right. Bye, everybody. Thank you.